Theologians claim that Paul criticized the law because it was too legalistic and it was considered to be a works-based religion. According to them, Paul's gospel said that Christians had died to the law and they were free from it. But did the Apostle Paul really say that the law was done away with? Let's talk about it in today's session. Here in Luke 21, Messiah prophesied about the times of the Gentiles. The prophecy is a foretelling of a time when the Gentiles would not just have dominion over the world, they would also destroy Jerusalem and have control over the chosen people. Let's read verses 20 through 24 to see what it says. He said, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by enemies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people." Who was he talking about? The house of Judah. He said they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. It should be obvious to all that this prophecy was fulfilled. We are living in the days when the times of the Gentiles are coming to an end. The signs are all around us for those with eyes to see. So when the Gentiles took control of Jerusalem, they later took control of the gospel as well. The question is, what did they do with it? When they trampled the city of Jerusalem, did they also trample the truth of the gospel, insert their own leaven, and then create the world religion of Christianity? I'm going to share some excerpts from this article from History Skills called "How Did Christianity Change from a Persecuted Minority to the Largest Religion in the World?" The article begins by telling us that Christianity is the world's largest religion with over 2 billion followers. Its journey from a small persecuted sect in the Roman Empire to a global faith spanning continents and cultures is a testament to the resilience and adaptability of its teachings and followers. Now we know that the roots trace back to Messiah and his disciples. They were followers of the way because he is the way, the truth, and the life. But pagans called them Christians. But this original group, these believers, were all Israelites. And we often forget that the Roman Empire controlled the region where they lived. Their message was not well received by the Romans or the religious leaders of the day. So this says, it was a time of great political and social upheaval, with the Roman Empire exerting its influence over vast territories. Christians, seen as subversive and threatening to the established order, were often persecuted and forced to practice their faith in secret. Yet, despite these challenges, Christianity not only survived but thrived, evolving from a persecuted minority into the state religion of the Roman Empire within a few centuries. It says, despite being a minority and facing persecution, early Christians were resilient. They established communities, developed rituals, and began to formulate doctrine. Now, the narrative that we were taught is that the Roman Emperor Constantine had a miraculous vision, and he converted to this supposed religion that they were so opposed to initially. Well, it's a lie. I've already talked about that in previous sessions. But it goes on to say the writings of the apostles and early church leaders, which later formed the New Testament of the Christian Bible, played a crucial role in defining Christian beliefs and spreading the faith. The article goes on to say one of the key features of the early spread of Christianity was Paul the Apostle. Originally a persecutor of Christians, Paul converted after experiencing a vision of the resurrected Messiah on the road to Damascus. He became a tireless missionary, traveling extensively throughout the Roman Empire and establishing Christian communities in key cities such as Corinth, Ephesus, and Philippi. Paul's letters to these communities, many of which are included in the New Testament, provided guidance on Christian doctrine and practice, and played a crucial role in shaping the early church. It says Christianity's message of hope and salvation, its promise of eternal life, and its emphasis on love and charity resonated with many people across the Roman Empire, particularly among the poor and marginalized. It goes on to say the faith's inclusivity. It was open to all, regardless of social status, gender, or ethnicity, made it appealing to a wide audience. So how did the gospel go from being a threat to a message of hope, love, and inclusivity? Why was it so threatening before? Did the message change? What caused the mass appeal? So in the last session, we talked about how Paul was sent out by the apostles. He said he was sent primarily to the Gentiles. It was Paul's gospel that made the faith so appealing. But why? Is it because of his antagonism toward the early believers, or was it because of some of his writings that appear to be contradictory? Let's dig a little deeper. Let's look at this passage from Matthew 5:17 through 19, and keep in mind that Yeshua is speaking. Listen to what he says. Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments, and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Now, those words were spoken by the one who is called the chief cornerstone. He said he did not come to destroy the law. He said, whosoever shall break one of these least commandments or teach men to do so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Let's look at this from Leviticus 12:2 through 3. Moses is told to say this to the children of Israel. If a woman have conceived seed and born a man-child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. According to the days of the separation for her infirmity shall she be unclean. And in the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Now, family, did Messiah say he didn't come to do away with the law? He said this. Now let's look at what Paul said. This comes from Galatians 5:1 through 4. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to the whole law. Christ is become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you are justified by the law, you are fallen from grace. Now, religious leaders say the law has been done away with, and they point to the writings of Paul, passages like this one. It has been argued that since Paul didn't meet Messiah during his earthly ministry, he could not accurately reflect his teachings. That's one of the reasons given for some of the contradictions. However, do you know what religious leaders fail to do? They don't ask, who was Paul talking to? Paul wrote this letter to the church in Galatia and told them that if they became circumcised, Christ would profit them nothing. Is this a contradiction? You would think so, if you fail to recognize the distinction between Israelites and the other nations. Let's go back to the passage that we covered in the last session. This comes from Acts 15:1. And certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, except you be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved. So we have Paul saying, no, circumcision is not required. But then these men from Judea are saying, if you are not circumcised, you cannot be saved. Who were they talking to? Let's go on. Here we see in Acts 15 that Paul and Barnabas presented their case to the 12, those who were called the foundation stones. They wanted them to make a decision about the matter requiring Gentiles to be circumcised. And here we see in verses 19 through 20 that James stood up and he told them what the ruling would be. He said, my sentence is that we trouble not them which from among the Gentiles are turned to Yah, but that we write unto them that they abstain from pollutions of idols, and from fornication, and from things strangled, and from blood. So they are talking about Gentiles as in the other nations here. I believe those who are saying that every time you see the word Gentile in the New Testament, it's talking about the northern kingdom, help to create some of the confusion. It does not fit in every case when you read it in context. The ruling of the council was that Gentiles only had to adhere to 4 things. It said nothing about being circumcised. This tells us that the Gentiles Paul and Barnabas are talking about in this situation are not Israelites from the northern kingdom. By bloodline, they were still the seed of Jacob. The council would have been condoning the breaking of the law by not enforcing the law of circumcision for Israelites. And the theory that says, well, Paul was only talking about circumcision of the heart. In this context, that's not correct. As we see here in Galatians 2:1 through 3, Paul traveled with Barnabas when he went to meet with the apostles and shared with them what he was preaching among the Gentiles, because he wanted them to acknowledge that what he was saying was right. And it says he took Titus with him. Now look at what it says in verse 3. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. But that's not what happened with Timothy. Let's look at that. In Acts 16, we're going to see what happened right after the apostles gave that command that Gentiles only had to follow 4 commandments. So in verses 1 through 3, we see that Paul left Jerusalem and traveled to Derbe and Lystra. And it says he found a certain disciple there named Timothy. His mother was an Israelite, and it says his father was Greek. Listen to what it says in verse 3. Paul wanted to have him go on with him. Paul wanted Timothy to go on with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Israelites who were in that region, for they all knew that his father was Greek. Now, family, why did Paul circumcise Timothy but not Titus? Again, this happened right after the Jerusalem Council said Gentiles only had to keep 4 things. Circumcision was not one of them. The other question is, why circumcise Timothy if he really believed that circumcision had no value? Timothy either had a father who was a Hellenized Greek, Paul was too scared to stand up to the Israelites, or he was being a hypocrite. And if he was being hypocritical, why accuse Peter of hypocrisy? There was a confrontation between Peter and Paul in Galatians 2 when Peter went to visit the assembly in Antioch. Listen to this. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised. They desired only that we should remember the poor, the very thing which I also was eager to do. Now when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face, because he was to be blamed. For before certain men came from James, he would eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Yehudis also played the hypocrite with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, if you, being a Yehudi, live in the manner of Gentiles, and not as the Israelites, why do you compel Gentiles to live as Israelites? So Peter didn't have a problem with sitting and eating with Gentiles. Now take note that they were fellowshipping, eating. It didn't say Peter was eating everything that the Gentiles were eating. So he was fellowshipping with them, but when Yehudis came to Antioch from Jerusalem, he didn't want to be seen with them. So Paul was upset because it seemed hypocritical to tell the Gentiles that you only have to do 4 things to be accepted into the fellowship, and then later make it seem like they were not accepted because they were not circumcised. Now let's remember that Paul and Barnabas were told to share the letter with the Gentiles, that they only had to do 4 things. And now one of the pillars had come to them. He had fellowshiped with them, and then he stopped doing it after the other men came from Jerusalem. Was that right? But there's a key point here that we can't miss. Paul and Barnabas had been given the right hand of fellowship to go to Gentiles. And Peter and the other apostles went to the circumcised. They used that term for Israelites. And we have an example of Paul circumcising Timothy, but not Titus. Clearly, a distinction was made between those who were bloodline Israelites versus those who were converts. Messiah told the disciples, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel first. That would have included the northern kingdom family, and Paul tried to do that, but they would not receive him. Let's say the majority of them did not. Listen to what Paul says when he's speaking to the assembly in Antioch. This is Acts 13:26. men and brethren, sons of the family of Abraham. Who's he talking to? And those among you who fear Yah, to you the word of this salvation has been sent. Let's look at Acts 13:16 through 29 so that we can verify that Paul did try to speak to Israelites. Then Paul stood up and motioning with his hand said, Men of Israel, and you who fear Yah, listen. He's saying, the Most High of this people, and then he clarifies, Israel. The Most High of this people, Israel, chose our fathers and exalted the people when they dwelt as strangers in the land of Egypt. You had the 12 tribes in Egypt, not just the house of Judah. And with an uplifted arm, he brought them out of it. Now for a time of about 40 years, he put up with their ways in the wilderness. And when he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he distributed their land to them by allotment. Now let's drop down to verses 42 through 46 of that same chapter. And this is after Paul had recounted the history of what happened to Israel after they came out of Egypt. He then told them about Messiah's coming and how Israel had rejected him. He says, so when the Yehudis went out of the synagogue, then the Gentiles begged that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. Now, family, why would the Gentiles need to beg to hear these words if they were the northern kingdom? Messiah told them, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel first. Verse 43 says, now when the congregation had broken up, many of the Yehudis and devout proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who speaking to them persuaded them to continue in the grace of Yah. Now listen. On the next Sabbath, almost the whole city came together to hear the word of Yah. Listen. But when the Yehudis saw the multitudes, they were filled with envy, and contradicting and blaspheming, they opposed the things spoken by Paul. Then Paul and Barnabas grew bold and said, please don't miss this, it was necessary that the word of Yah should be spoken to you first. He tried to go to Israel first, the lost sheep. But since you reject it, he says, and judge yourselves unworthy of everlasting life, behold, we turn to the Gentiles. Now let's go back to the beginning to see who those men were who were trying to force circumcision on the Gentiles. This comes from Acts 15:1 through 5. And certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Therefore, when Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and dispute with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders about this question. So being sent on their way to the church, they passed through Phoenicia and Samaria, describing the conversion of the Gentiles, and they caused great joy to all the brethren. And when they had come to Jerusalem, they were received by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all things that Yah had done with them. But some of the sect of the Pharisees who believed rose up saying, it is necessary to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses. Now let's go back and see what James said about those men who were trying to force the circumcision. This comes from Acts 15:24 through 29. James is saying this: since we have heard that some who went out from us have troubled you with words, unsettling your souls, saying, you must be circumcised and keep the law. Circumcised and keep the law. Listen, to whom we gave no such commandment. James is saying we never instructed those men to go out and say to you that you needed to be circumcised or to keep the law. He said it seemed good to us, being assembled with one accord, to send chosen men to you. Who were they sending? Who did the apostles send? Our beloved Barnabas and Paul, men who have risked their lives for the name of Yeshua. We have therefore sent Judas and Silas. So they're sending additional men who will also report the same things by word of mouth. For it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay upon you no greater burden than these necessary things, that you abstain from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality. If you keep yourselves from these, you will do well. Weren't those four things a part of the law? Were they not a part of the law? But there were specific things that applied to the bloodline Israelites, and circumcision was one of them. So let's see what Paul said about those men who were agitators and Judaizers. This comes from Galatians 6:12 through 13. As many as desire to make a fair show in the flesh, they constrain you to be circumcised, only lest they should suffer persecution for the cross of Yeshua. Listen, for neither they themselves who are circumcised keep the law, but desire to have you circumcised, that they may glory in your flesh. Family, James said they didn't give a command to those men. Paul is saying those men were circumcised, but they were not keepers of the law. Who are we talking about here? Let's look at Matthew 23:1 through 5. Messiah is speaking. He's speaking to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say and do not. They say and do not. The Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes were not keepers of the law. They tried to enforce it, but they did not do it. He said for they bind heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They were men pleasers. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to enforce laws. They were not keepers of the law. Now, if Paul was really preaching that the law was done away with and it was no longer relevant, then we shouldn't find examples of him keeping it. So let's look at Acts 21:15 through 25. And after those days, we packed and went up to Jerusalem. Also, some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us and brought with them a certain Nason of Cyprus, an early disciple, with whom we were to lodge. And when we had come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. When he had greeted them, he told in detail the things which Yah had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the Most High. And they said to him, "You see, brother, how many myriads of Israelites there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. But they have been informed about you, that you teach all the Israelites, listen, who are among the Gentiles." Clearly, you can see a distinction right here. You teach the Israelites who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. What then? The assembly must certainly meet, for they will hear that you have come. Therefore, do what we tell you. Do what we tell you, Paul. We have 4 men who have taken a vow. Take them and be purified with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things, please listen, of which they were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. But concerning the Gentiles who believe, we have written and decided that they should observe no such thing, except that they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality. Family, what's happening here? We see Paul sharing a modified message to Gentile believers, but he is abiding by Torah. You're going to see here in Acts 18:18 through 21 that Paul was still practicing the law and participating in the feast days. It says, "So Paul still remained a good while, then he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow." This was a Nazirite vow, which stipulated that a person cut his hair at the conclusion of a specified period. Why was Paul doing that if the law had been done away with and it served no purpose? It says, "And he came to Ephesus and left them there, but he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Yehudis. When they asked him to stay a longer time with them, he did not consent, but took leave of them, saying, 'I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem. But I will return again to you, Yah willing.' And he sailed from Ephesus." Family, why would he continue to keep the law and participate in the feast days if he's really saying the law had been done away with? That's not making sense, is it? It's not making sense because everything Paul said was not pertaining to the bloodline descendants of Israel. And it's hard to wrap your brain around that. A lot of us were brought up in Christianity. We were taught that we were Gentiles. And so we ascribed to the teachings that the law was no longer required. We grew up on the "but Paul said" mantra. All you need to do is have faith. Believe that Christ died and he rose from the dead, and accept him as your Lord and Savior. That meant that you were saved. Then you had to be baptized and then join a church, and based on the doctrine taught by the Baptists, once you're saved, you're always saved. We were told that if you tried to keep the law, you had to keep all of them, and there were over 600 laws to keep. The thing is, no one ever gave us a list of those laws. We just lumped them all together and said, we're no longer under the law, we're under grace. So here in Acts 25:4-8, an accusation was made against Paul that he was a lawbreaker. Religious leaders and other Yehudis brought a charge against him to Festus. What was the outcome? It says, but Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore he said, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man, to see if there is any fault in him. And when he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. When he had come, the Yehudis who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul. Listen, which they could not prove. They couldn't prove it. But Paul answered for himself and said, neither against the law of the Yehudis, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. Now, if he was really against the law, and he was teaching other Israelites to break it, how is it that they found no proof? No proof? And Paul is saying out of his own mouth that he was not against the law. As you can see, there's a lot to dig into. Let's look at this from World History Encyclopedia. Paul the Apostle. It says Paul was a follower of Yeshua who famously converted to Christianity on the road to Damascus after persecuting the very followers of the community that he joined. However, as we will see, Paul is better described as one of the founders of the religion rather than a convert to it. Scholars attribute 7 books of the New Testament to Paul. He was an influential teacher and a missionary to much of Asia Minor and present-day Greece. It says, in the last century, scholars have come to appreciate Paul as the actual founder of the religious movement that would become Christianity. Paul was a diaspora Israelite, a member of the party of the Pharisees, who experienced a revelation of the resurrected Messiah. After this experience, he traveled widely throughout the Eastern Roman Empire, spreading the good news that Messiah would soon return from heaven and usher in the reign of Yah, i.e. the kingdom. Paul was not establishing a new religion. He believed that his generation was the last before the end time, when this age would be transformed. However, as time passed and Messiah did not return, the 2nd century church fathers turned to Paul's writings to validate what would ultimately be the creation of Christian dogma. Please don't miss that. Thus, Paul could be viewed as the founder of Christianity as a separate religion apart from Judaism. Now listen carefully to the points this author is making, and you will see how they used Paul's words to bring about the replacement doctrine. So the author says, if Messiah was the first founder of Christianity, Paul was the second. Paul's particular contributions were threefold, systematizing 3 views. First, the view that the religion of Israel had been declared null and void. The law of Moses had brought sin, not redemption. Now, why would Paul continue keeping the law if he really believed that it was null and void? The second view is that since all of humanity not just Gentiles, but Israelites as well, was lost in sin, the only solution was to be found in the redemption from sin brought about by the death and resurrection of Messiah. There was no salvation except through him. And third, the view that Yah has rejected the old people, talking about the Israelites, and replaced them with a new people, the Gentiles, now called Christians. Do you see this? Do you see it? It goes on to say, this is what makes Paul the second founder, and in many ways the real founder of Christianity. The author says it was Paul who delivered the Christian religion from Judaism. It was he who confidently regarded the gospel as a new force, abolishing the religion of the law. More recently, the distinguished American scholar E.P. Sanders has written this: Paul explicitly denies that the Jewish covenant can be effective of salvation, thus denying the basis of Judaism. Now let's remember that they use these terms interchangeably, and I'm not trying to deviate too much from the intent of the author as I go through this. But it says, from the beginning, Israelites resisted and despised their own Savior, the promised Messiah. They put him to death. As punishment for this crime, Yah brought about the destruction of the temple, or the Jerusalem temple, by the Romans in 70 CE, thereby, listen, endorsing the divine rejection of the old Israel and the proclamation of Christianity as the new Israel. This family, this is their foundation right here. The replacement theology. None of the things that we read in Revelation 21 regarding the 12 foundation stones or the 12 gates representing the 12 tribes of Israel will fit in this narrative. So it says, from this point on, or perhaps slightly later, relations between Israelites and Christians come to an end. Neither side shows any interest in the other than polemics. And what's polemics? It's something that stirs up controversy by having a negative opinion, usually aimed at a particular group. We know they had a negative opinion of us. That's why we ended up in slavery. So it says, listen to this, the Israelite Christians have become heretics and soon fade away altogether. Well, where did they go? They went into slavery. It says in the New Testament, we have 14 letters traditionally assigned to Paul, but the scholarly consensus now holds that of the 14, 7 were actually written by Paul. 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, Philemon, Philippians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, and Romans. It says the others were most likely written by a disciple of Paul's using his name to carry authority. We understand these letters to be circumstantial, meaning they were never intended as systematic theology or as treatises on Christianity. In other words, the letters are responses to particular problems and circumstances as they arose in various communities. They were not written as universal dictates to serve as Christian ideology, but only came to have importance and significance over time. What we need to understand is that the Romans used the doctrine of Paul to establish the Roman Catholic Church. They added their own leaven. Here's the thing. They needed Paul's doctrine and Peter's authority. Both Peter and Paul were said to be founders of the Roman Catholic Church. Did you know that? We're going to dig down into that on the live this coming Wednesday, so be sure to join me for that. But let's wrap up with this passage from 2 Peter 3:14 through 16. Peter is talking about how some of Paul's writings were hard to understand, but he also said, untaught and unstable people were twisting Paul's words to their own destruction. Listen, he said, as they also do the rest of the scriptures. So they didn't just go after Paul's writings. So we now have to let the Ruach show us what that leaven was. So let's make sure we understand that the words that actually came from the mouth of Yah is inspired. The words that came out of his mouth. Here we have one of the foundation stones telling us that untaught and unstable people twisted some of those words. Surely their words were not inspired. Peter said they began twisting things. Well, what was it? Again, let's continue that discussion on the live. But if this message has been a blessing to you, please remember to hit the like and share it. You're also welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. We normally upload messages on Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. Yah willing. Join me next time.